Loud. Awesome. All right. Thanks for the reminder, Philip.
Yes, thank you, Philip.
Strange. Okay, yeah, cool. So we're starting with a gamma 4, working out the basic consequences of Aristotle introducing as the most stable and best known of all the principles, namely what has been called the principle of non-contradiction. And he states it as the same thing cannot at the same time belong and also not belong to the same thing in the same respect. This is the most stable of all starting points. Okay, and somewhere along the line that mentions that it is the best known. Of course, a lot of people don't know it, at least not explicitly. And so this is actually a good opportunity in the course of talking about this to reflect on what it means to be best known. It's obviously not that which is most on the forefront of your mind, right? So just a sec, oops.
It goes back to that closest to our senses and closest to us versus closest to the nature.
First in terms of the matter.
Yeah.
First for us. That's
Exactly.
what I thought of as well.
Exactly. And so one way to state this point is, if anything is to be known at all, if knowledge is at all possible, then you are already committed to this principle of non-contradiction. There is no such thing as knowledge. There is not even, and part of his point today is there's not even a point of, it's not even possible to refer to something, signify, that isn't at the same time a commitment to this principle. So it's not that it's on your, that everybody knows it and could recite it. And it's not like that people are most certain of it, have some kind of subjective feeling that it's really strong when they think of the principle of non-contradiction. It's rather that it is the most fundamental knowledge and is known, is included in any other knowledge, whether that knowledge is an affirmation of something, Socrates is Greek, or the denial of something, Socrates is beautiful. So, this is just kind of this is an opportunity to think a little bit about this the structure of knowledge. That what's best known is often not what's on the forefront of our minds, but the way Aristotle is using it is that which is best known is that which is most in itself knowable and not known through another. And since anything, if it's to be known at all, is a knowledge of this principle is known in every act of knowledge. Okay, so it pervades every act of knowledge. And every act of knowledge is structured by it. And every act of knowledge is so structured by it that any supposed act of knowledge that violates it ceases to be knowledge. And so we see here that the best known is better cashed out as that which is most fundamental to the knowledge of anything, rather than subjectively as something that you're aware of or something that you're good at reciting. All right. Any general remarks about that? About this whole idea of something being best known, like the principle of non-contradiction? For some reason, just a sec. I think I screwed up my view here. I can't see anybody anymore. Okay, there we go.
Yeah, I think the idea of an object or of anything being one at all seems to relate to this in an important way, which is that we cannot think of something coherently as one without the principle of non-contradiction, because we wouldn't be able to determine it as one is against many.
Hmm.
And
Yeah, no, that brings us right into it, right? And
That's zeta 1, though, not gamma 4.
Indeed. Let me see. Just checking to see if I'm getting any messages from anybody trying to get in. I am not. All right.
Maybe one of the things for some reason, I started listening to Brandon's lectures on
Oh, yeah.
spirit of trust, and he's always talking about whether Hegel's taking these things as not, well, obviously this is Aristotle, but same issue is whether these things is a material incompatibility, or is it only an epistemic incompatibility?
Mm.
This to be and not to be by means of thing, right? I think a little bit further down here, like down here where he talks about the difference between stating something and signifying something, sort of, I think, trying to maybe, I'm not sure if I'm reading things into Aristotle there, if I'm trying to make a.
Mm. Do you feel like cashing out what the differences between material and epistemic incompatibility is?
Well, yeah, one thing would say that, that the object that we're talking about can't be one way or the other. Another thing is maybe our knowledge about it we can't hold we can't hold conflicting accounts within ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Is it saying something about our knowledge, or is it saying something about the world?
Mm-hmm.
Roughly speaking, is the distinction there. I
see. Yeah, I want to resist that distinction. But that doesn't mean it isn't clarifying, right? I mean, because I just, my first thought is, what does it mean to say that, my knowledge is about what it purports to be knowledge of, but that needn't be the world? Like, objects can be one way and my knowledge about them can be another way. Maybe I'm oversimplifying this, but I certainly read Aristotle as saying, that there is a level of thought that that is at the same time a reflection on thought, and in the same breath, a reflection on the structure of being, or on being. And that it's a certain, well, what he says, if you take perceptions as thoughts, then we get into, talking about perceptions rather than the world, or talking about the world rather than perceptions, right? But thought is, so to speak, their prior unity, or that which is not differentiated in this way. I don't know, is that fair or not? What do you think, Peter?
Well, of course, if you're of the position that of the identity, thought and being are identical, then of course there is no distinction between those two things, right? Which is sort of the point you're trying to make here. Yeah. And both Hegel and Aristotle, I think, are in that camp, right?
Right, but okay, good. You're right. And the only question is that a premise or is that a conclusion? And I want to argue it's a conclusion, but you actually...
Yeah, you're right. You're right. It should be a conclusion, right? I mean, that's too big of a thing to start off as a premise.
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe it's just I'm going off in the weeds already, but we continue going down the text.
All right. So there's a lot to talk about. There's only a couple things I'm really planning on pulling out to talk about today, so we don't overload the session. But I welcome remarks about other sections that you think are particularly interesting or mystifying that you would like the group to help shed light on. All right. But let me see here. I didn't get everything. All right. So he starts off Gamma 4, basically talking about, he starts off Gamma 4 saying, even though the principle of non-contradiction, that the same thing, the same thing cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same thing. is in fact denied by many. And indeed, natural philosophers often not only deny it, but they take the world to actually exemplify, right, this idea that things are and are not in the same respect. Okay, so which is to say everything is contradictory. Everything is a contradiction. And what is interesting, well, one of the things I want to talk about is not so much, this idea that you can't speak in a contradictory manner and expect to say anything true about anything at all. We all kind of know that. I'm kind of more interested in his justifications. What is it he's actually drawing on to defend the principle, this idea that things cannot be and not be in the same respect at the same time. So he begins by saying, well, there are people who think that this needs to be demonstrated. And he makes the remark that they don't understand demonstration, even though they demand one, because their demand shows that they think that everything can be demonstrated. And that is not true. Hence, you can't demonstrate anything to these people because they don't quite know what demonstration is. Okay, so there's that, the problem of ignorance. And then he gets to a very long section, and I don't think we need to go through everything, but the question is, so what kind of demonstration is possible here? How do you demonstrate first principles? You can't demonstrate a first principle from a higher principle or a firster principle, right? Yeah, your first principles cannot be derived from anything because they are the things that everything is derived from. And so argumentatively, and he's talking about arguing with people, argumentatively, you're in a strange situation, right? You can't argue directly for the truth of the proposition, things cannot be the same and not the same as themselves in the same respect at the same time. So it just looks like maybe it's just something that we take on faith, right? It's an act of faith, or it's just an assumption, a working hypothesis. But he doesn't go there. He says there is a way to demonstrate, and it's demonstration by refutation, right? So I can't directly derive first principles from higher principles because there are none. But I can show that anyone who denies them presupposes them. Okay, so every denial of them shows their truth. And that is, it's a demonstration by refutation. One can call it a dialectical demonstration, that the refutation is not a refutation, but is in fact a confirmation of what's supposed to be refuted. And so this is the situation in which a philosopher finds themselves in when they are talking first principles. So that assumes that the person you're talking with knows something about demonstrations and refutations, and when we can't necessarily count on that these days, but we can try. So, and what's interesting to point out here is, and I'd like to just kind of read the beginning of this and get your thoughts on it. The difference between what Peter just brought up, the difference between stating and signifying. Let's just think briefly about that. So I'll read from the middle of the page, beginning the starting point. So the kind of argument I just sketched, he says, the starting point for all such arguments is to ask the disputant not to state something to be or not to be, since someone might take this to be assuming the starting point at issue, but rather to signify something, both to himself and to another person, since that is necessary if indeed he is to say something Mhm. For if he does not grant this, no argument is possible for such a person, either with himself or in another. And I'm just going to add that such a person is what he mentions is no different than a vegetable. You don't try to prove things to vegetables, and people who act like vegetables, you don't need to try to prove anything to them. It's a big.
We still have to eat our vegetables.
It's a big load off your mind once you recognize that this thing that looks human in front of you is a vegetable. All right. But if he does grant it, demonstration will be possible, since there will already be something definite. Boom, definite. The one responsible for it, however, is not the one who gives the demonstration, we philosophers, but the one who submits to it, since in doing away with argument, he submits to argument. Further, anyone who agrees to this has agreed that something is true without a demonstration, so that not everything will be so-and-so and not so-and-so. All right, it's very compact, but what jumps out to you about what's the difference between stating and signifying, or what's the significance of something being definite? And why is it important that not the philosopher begin, but the ones submitting to the demonstration that begins? Any thoughts?
Peter. If nobody, I don't want to jump ahead. But, if the person, I guess the difference between demonstrating and demonstrating and he has some weird locution, but you can show things and then there's proving things. If you use those sort of terms, you can't prove everything, because every syllogism, every logical argument always starts with something taken to be true to begin with, and that's that assumption and starting point. And that's the thing he's trying to avoid. So there's a difference between proving something and just demonstrating it. And so he's sort of, I don't want to say he's conning them into it, but it's that if they if they signify something to himself, like it's raining,
right,
something like that, then they've already assumed that is something that is, rather than is not. It is not something that both is and is not, if they can say it's definite. So they've made the move, and presumably they accept that it is definite by them uttering it or demonstrating it. Right. So they sort of made that first move and assumption, say, okay, given that definite starting point, now we can work with something.
Beautiful. Yes, totally agree. Richard.
So this reminds me of kind of logic and from high school, and we weren't using, language as challenging kind of as Aristotle, but of kind of the fallacy of the burden of proof. I guess. I'm not sure if anyone also sees that connection, or I don't have a lot to say, but I guess just thought I'd throw that in there.
I appreciate it. Do you remember how to state, how to signify the fallacy of the burden of proof?
I think I'll hold off. My brain's still sort of unwinding from work. So
okay, yeah, that's cool. Well, I don't exactly remember that fallacy either, but yeah. So I'm just going to acknowledge it and hope. I don't know how to spell out the fallacy of the burden of proof, but definitely there's the question.
The wiki entry.
Okay, yeah, you might as well, in case it triggers somebody's thoughts.
The burden of proof fallacy is a logic fallacy that occurs when someone tries to evade their burden of proof. So that's kind of the opposite one. Maybe Richard was thinking of the sort of the contrapositive or the core.
Okay. So so arguing for first principles, it puts you in a specific, let's call it logical situation, right? If you argue for first principles, from other principles, then you've automatically made those other principles the real first principles. All right. And now you got to argue for them. And then you're going to find other principles, perhaps, to argue. And then you're going to find out each time when you argue for first principles, the things you're arguing for aren't first principles anymore, but rather that which they're derived from. And so now you're in the problem of an infinite regress. This cannot go on forever. But the problem, we don't get into the infinite regress because there are no such thing as first principles. We got into the infinite regress because we thought that we could argue for first principles from higher principles. That was our mistake. Not arguing, but arguing from higher principles than first principles. When you say it like that, the contradiction becomes pretty apparent, right? So the problem with first principles is not that they're irrational. I think that's kind of common that these days that we say, first principles are just, conventions. We just accept them, or we just we have this hypothesis and we just set them forth as hypotheses and then work from them. But there's no such thing as true principles, true first principles, because if you try, and then the idea is, well, then, first principles are either something you actually have to dogmatically accept on faith, or you have to argue for them. And if you argue for them, then you're going to need higher principles. And then bam, they're not first principles anymore, right? So the idea of first principles are an illusion. This is something that, this is a kind of argumentation that one hears quite a bit. And it's just significant what direction Aristotle takes. He doesn't say, well, you just have to believe them. And he doesn't say, there are no such thing as first principles. And he doesn't say, well, let's look for higher principles. I mean, he recognizes the problem. So he has to get very deep and very fundamental. And the idea is that when you say anything at all, if you think that you're saying something definite, right, then you're already committed to this principle. And to deny it is to deny that you're able to signify anything, to be able to designate something like it's raining or the dog or anything like that. So what he's saying here is it's not just, highfalutin scientific discourse. It is in fact any significant statement that is committed to this principle of non-contradiction.
It also strikes me that this is the structure of that. Avoiding an infinite regress is also perhaps in some of the earlier books we were talking about, like why being isn't a genus of all the 10 types of being. Because again, he's saying that
right.
If it were, then it's a genus. Well, if it's a genus, then we have to have a principle of contrariety for that
right.
genus and stuff like that. So it's no longer a starting point because we have something prior to it.
Exactly. So exactly, being isn't the species of anything else, and so there's the problem of saying what is it? And Aristotle says, well, we don't really have that problem because it doesn't refer to one thing, it refers to 10 things that we can talk about in terms of the categories. All right, so now the other thing is, I just we will encounter a lot in the Schmidt book, a refrain, to be is to be something. To be is to be something specific. To be is to be some limited thing. To be is to be definite. And that is precisely what Aristotle says in this paragraph, right? If the person who is accidentally refuting themselves does grant it, demonstration will be possible since there will already be something definite. Okay, so that is super salient and we need to hold on to it. But I see Tyler's hand. Go ahead, please, Tyler.
I was just going to mention this. I think this may address part of Peter's earlier distinction between epistemology and then the world, right? Because the making a determination requires the principle of non-contradiction in a special way. It must be the case that this is the first principle in order to make any determination at all. And that's a relation that goes on. That relation between making determinations and the principle of non-contradiction occurs in any act, and that act occurs in a world, and they're all together. So I think that gets us beyond the epistemology concern, because the act has to, the rules for the activity of making determinations are at the same time rules for the world.
Ah, it sounds like Kant's highest principle. No, I'm not. Peter, do you want to follow up on that, or just let it sit?
I'll just let it sit. I don't have anything to say on that right now.
Okay. Right. Okay, cool. Okay.
Hey, Michael,
Yeah.
Clark had a question in the chat. If
Oh.
you want to ask it, Clark? I know he's.
Well, see, he's at work. So Clark, if you're uncomfortable speaking, I'm happy to read it out loud from the chat. Oh, he's talking about weeds. You must be living in Oregon. Living in the weeds. All right. Anyway, one question from reading today that arose for me was the relationship of, quote, having knowledge to, quote, having knowledge of being qua being. My thinking is that knowledge can only follow being. Being cannot follow knowledge. So how can being qua being really be considered an object of which knowledge can be known then? What gives knowledge license to know what underlies knowledge? Okay, yeah, can't talk. Okay. Oh, okay, well, I mean, that's certainly a very fundamental question. My thing is that knowledge can only follow being. Okay. Now, my first remark here is, but that presupposes that you have independent access to being. And so, and indeed, access that is devoid or separate from knowledge. And that raises the question, if that is the case, if your access to being is separate from knowledge, such that you cannot be said to know that you are accessing being, then isn't this kind of an empty gesture? Yeah, I guess that's my phrase, right? What makes it an empty gesture, right? Because I'm claiming that there's this access to being that is totally unrelated to knowledge, but since it's unrelated to knowledge, I can't know whether this is giving me access to what is really or what merely seems to be. But that's the whole question. That's the whole question. So it seems to me that knowledge must play some role in any access to being, because otherwise we're never justified in saying, you know, for instance, what my perceptual organs give me is being. What would ground that if this whole event were completely severed from all knowledge?
Yeah, it seems like it's almost, again, reminds me of Hegel's introduction to phenomenology, that if you assume that knowledge is knowing is a medium through which, and then the medium will affect things, you're already off on the wrong track, right? So I guess what you have to do is you have to suspend the assumption that it is either the same, the knowledge and being are the same, or they are different.
Right.
You have to sort of suspend that and come to the conclusion later. But if you start from the assumption roughly that there is a distinction between the two, because I don't think you can say what Clark said, without assuming that there's a difference.
Mhm.
One is prior to the other, so.
Right. Right. And exactly. And that assumption, what's the status of that assumption? Is it itself knowledge? Is it something is it something I can ever know? Or is it an act of faith that, that's, well, I'm just going to assume this and see where it gets me, see what works, right? And so now, and then we're kind of off to that races, and then we get to the problem that lots of mutually incompatible starting points work, right? And so none of them can lay claim to being the truth of anything, because other competing ones work just as well, and they mutually are mutually exclude each other. And then we get the famous undergraduate assertion, everything is just contradictory. Contradiction is reality. But anyway, that's one way to make fun of what one might conclude from this situation. Now, another thing that I might want to raise, that is concerns actually what we're going to talk about, is because I really want to talk about what Aristotle says about coincidence, and that coincidence don't have coincidence, but only substances have coincidence. And at the very beginning, we were talking about the categories, and I gave everybody a homework question to say, what is it that we can say about we can say about anything at all that would qualify it as being something, and based on the category, what we learned in the categories. And the basic idea is that everything, in order to be anything, any specific thing, is going to be in some dependence relation. It's going to be dependent on something else, like white is dependent on Socrates, or something else, or something is going to have other things dependent on it, right? So Socrates is going to be prior to whiteness and musicality, and those are dependent on Socrates in a way that Socrates is not dependent on them. So why I'm bringing that up is that this is completely and totally non-empirical, and it's just based on what anything, be it empirical or non-empirical, what we must be able to say about it, if it is to be anything at all. And so that is, for me, kind of attaining this level where what we're talking about is both how to talk, but also what things necessarily are. Things are necessarily in certain dependence relationships. And if you say, well, there's this thing that's nothing's dependent on it, and it's not dependent on anything, it's severed from all relations and everything like that. And then I'd say, well, start talking to me about it. And then all of a sudden, this thing is going to find itself in rich relations. Or you're going to say, well, there's nothing to be said about it, but I know it's there. I know it's a thing, right? And at this point, you're basically dealing with, a fantasy that there could be such a thing. But the point of that early exercise was to get you to actually exercise the thought that what I'm doing is I'm thinking what things necessarily are. And at the same time, I'm recognizing the right way to talk about that which they necessarily are. So my thinking and being are one, or language and being are one. And that's the level that we have to constantly climb back up to and try to stay there, because that's the level where it doesn't make any sense anymore to distinguish being as something independent of thought, and thought as something completely independent of being. In order to be anything, that thing must be in independence relations. And bam, that is an identity of being and thought. And one of the things that we're going to be doing today is giving that putting a little bit of meat on those bones. So that bones are very general, and you can say, well, that doesn't give us very much, does it? And my answer would be, it doesn't need to. Right? It doesn't need to. You just have to recognize the possibility that there is this level of thought that that allows you to think anything at all and get some content from that, namely dependence relations. And Aristotle caches those dependence relations out in 4 terms: substance, accident, universal, particular. We're going to get to that a little bit more today, but I just wanted to remind you of that and remind you that kind of knowledge is not separate from what it's knowledge of. It's not different. Hey, Tyler.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say something about world. I think there's a contradiction that has to be somehow overcome by anyone who says the world is, in some sense, external to thought, or that thought needs to access it. Right?
Mhm.
Because the determination of what it is to be a world occurs in the act of thinking or account giving.
Mm.
So it's already inside thought. And then you say it's inside thought and it is outside thought. So you're saying you're contradicting yourself. And so you have to specify a respect to get past that contradiction. So
Right.
in what respect is it inside or outside that makes it not a blatant contradiction?
Right. And of course, I mean, the whole burden of this really, and that we'll eventually get to, but we can't now because Aristotle's not talking about it, is, that when we talk about thought, we're not talking about your thought and my thought, right? We're talking about that which is the prior ground and unity of world and, or of the nature of things and the I don't know, the representation of them or the thinking about them or something like that. So, that is, so to speak, the metaphysical vocation is to establish that there is this overlap between thought and being, and not every thought is true. And so not every thought contains truth, in other words, contains the content of anything at all. And, since not every thought is true, the thought that we're talking about is that overlaps with the world. It would be the identity of thought and being. And that's the only thing, that's all we're focused on. And that domain is when Richard rightly mentioned logic, it feels very logical. And it feels like it's just these logical relations that obtain for everything, for every possible thing. Logic is the thought of the possible. And so anything that's possible will be in the scope of logic. We think not only everything that is, but everything that is possible. And so thought extends far beyond what we happen to see and call real because we can see it. Anyway, yeah, so I just want, I could go on and on, but I see a hand. Charlie.
I had to unmute.
Is that?
I don't think that's me. I don't know what that was.
It's your
Oh,
background music. I mean, it's a
Yeah,
leitmotif.
no, I don't think there's, okay, well, at any rate, the idea that being and thought are the same or they are simultaneous. Was there ever a time when there was being and not thought? For example, when we, this may not be a very relevant question at all, but at the Big Bang, at the very, was there being at that point and not thought yet?
Well, not your thought and my
I don't know if
thought.
that's even important to ask. I'm
No,
not.
that's actually that's a very live controversy. What's the
Miyasu?
Yeah, exactly. The ancestrality thesis. So Charlie, you're actually onto something with a very distinguished name, the ancestrality thesis, right? If being and thought are one, then who was sitting there at the Big Bang thinking it?
Yes.
I mean, we were going to get into that with that Quentin Miyasu thing that I wanted to do back in Kelly's group 2 years ago.
Right.
That's roughly going down that line of thought that Charlie's going down.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I
Right. Yeah.
wonder, and this is just a nascent thought, I haven't fleshed it out, but I wonder if even in posing that question, one is already separating being from thought. You know, I'm wondering if there's a logical yeah, I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, no, that is a fascinating thing to think about, but I don't have that big of a problem once we've distinguished thought from my thought, and thought being not temporal thinking like mine, but just but the web of logical relations of any possible content. Then yeah, that would in fact pre-exist the Big Bang, because the Big Bang is just the realization of certain possibilities of that logical web that is not in time, but structures every possibility in time. You know, yeah. Okay, that is okay. I'm not going to go any farther than that because it gets
Would it be
speculative
fair-
quickly.
Would it be fair to say that I think Hegel would might be of the opinion that that is not possible, that thought or the idea finds itself to a certain degree in nature.
Hmm.
And you know, at this very, very fundamental, very low kind of level. And that thought has always been contained in being. It's
Mhm.
always been there.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps it's just not arisen out of it, or has not become self-reflective, or become, I don't know if that's a valid thought or not.
No. It is. It's just, you know, one can ask, you know, how Aristotelian it is, but you know, the other thing is that, you know, for the Big Bang to be determinate, it must itself be something specific. It must be definite. It must be a content, which means it must already be enmeshed in logical relations. And so logic didn't come along. There's no point in time in which things became logical. Right. And just like there's no point in time when the Big Bang got around to inventing numbers. So, you know, the Big Bang is well, I mean, I could speculate on this, but I mean, it's just taking certain relevant sets of information that scientists are interested in and projecting them backwards. It's really nothing more than that. It doesn't help us understand thought, and it doesn't help us understand knowledge, and therefore it doesn't help us understand at all how you know, what determinacy is, what definiteness is. Anyway, that's my perhaps inadequate response. Richard.
Actually, that's a really great segue, because I wanted to qualify bringing this up because it's a little bit tangential.
Cool.
But what you just said at the end there, yeah, it doesn't affect our studies here, but if anyone's kind of follows this stuff, but like now they're not so sure about the idea of a Big Bang singularity. I don't know if anyone's made aware. I can post some links in the chat, but yeah, it's something that's been getting more just kind of like, it's come out in kind of the general public awareness now, like scientific.
This whole singularity thing, yeah.
Yeah, they're questioning the idea of like our conventional understanding of the Big Bang.
Ah, okay. That's good. I don't know if anybody knows very much about that. I don't. So, Richard, I need you to educate me on these things that you bring up. You can't assume that I know about them, but I only know that the singularity thesis is out there. I've had people tell me about it, and I wasn't aware that it has certain certain implications for how we're thinking the Big Bang. Anyway. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that interesting discussion. All right. Let's see here. So let's get to kind of what I wanted to get to, and then if we need to go back, we'll go back. But let's go to page 53, page 56. I have to take fewer notes. All right, so what I'm interested in is A2C. And in general, those who say this, which is basically to say the following: to signify anything. Okay, so like to signify human being is not only to pick out human being, but it's also to pick out not human being. And so so when I refer to the human being, I refer not just to the human being, I refer to absolutely everything. And every statement is like that, because that's how things are. And so Aristotle gives us a very interesting argument here that I want to discuss with you. So he says of those people, all right, and in general, those who say this do away with substance and essence. That probably doesn't seem more earth-shattering to you, but it ought to. For it is necessary for them to say that all are coincidence, and that there is no such thing as just the being for human or just the being for animal.
And you have the card?
Oh, sorry, I'm gonna.
I'm gonna get that now.
All right. For if anything is to be just the being for human, this will not be the being for not human, or the not being for human. And yet these are its denials. For what was signified was one thing, and this was something substance. But to signify the substance of something is to signify that the being for it is no other thing. But if for it to be just the being for human is either for it to be just the being for not human, or just the not being for human, it will be some other thing. So that it is necessary for them to say that this sort of account applies to nothing, but that all are coincidental. And here comes the first punchline. For substance and coincident are distinguished by this: the pale coincides with the human, right? The pale is a coincident of the human, because the human is pale, but not just what pale is. All right, let's see if we can make sense of that last line. Let me see that. Okay, so I got a little diagram that I'm just going to throw up here. It should remind you of our categories diagrams. Let me see. Okay, so I apologize for my diagrams, but so if you remember our
Do other
discussion.
people see his diagram?
Oh, can anybody see it? Is this not seeable or visible? Is that better?
I don't see it yet. Oh,
Okay.
there we are.
Is that big or small in your screen?
That's better. That's
that better?
sufficient. Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Does it help if is that better or worse?
Much better.
It's good, yeah.
It's as good as it's going to be. Right there is good.
Thanks. All right. So if you remember the category table, we were talking about things being said of a subject and not being said of a subject, and in a subject and not in a subject. And so what interests me here is what I'm calling account transfers. And so if you look at the diagram, right, we have man as universal, and then this man on the left. And then next to them, pale is universal, and then this pale as a particular. Now, and this is again getting at this whole being and thinking thing, or one, and because what Aristotle is noticing is no matter how we define what a human being is and what pale is, right? There are interesting asymmetries in terms of what can lend its being to something else. So what this chart is pointing out is that this man, for instance, this Socrates here, right? If Socrates is a man, then what is true of if Socrates is a human being, what is true of the human being will transfer to Socrates. So what's true of the human being is rational animal. Socrates, then this human being will be a rational animal, right? But the account doesn't transfer upwards. What's true of Socrates is not true of the human being as such, right? The human being as such is not married. The human being as such is not Greek. The human being as such is not pale. The account of the being of something only goes one way, from the universal to the particular, from the general to the particular. But you can't go up, which is kind of what induction implies. But you get into the logical problems of the Socrates. If Socrates embodies humanity, then every human being must be thought of as being, embodying Socrates. And if they don't embody Socrates, then they're not a human being. And that is absurd. All right. So just with respect to human being and this human being, we see the account only transfers one way. This human being is a two-footed animal or a rational animal. So what holds of the human being holds of Socrates. But what holds of Socrates does not hold of the human being. It doesn't transfer up. The same with, so Socrates is an example of substance, and pale is an example of equality. And the same relationship obtains that paleness, what's true of pale, that it's a color, will be true of this shade of pale, the shade that Socrates is. And it will be true to say of Socrates's paleness that it is a color. But what holds for this pale, this particular shade of pale, doesn't hold for the pale as such, because the pale as such contains many, or it contains many more shades of paleness. And so what distinguishes this instance of paleness is not attributable to the pale as such. And then finally, and this is what Aristotle is getting at here in this sentence, this man Socrates is pale. We can say this in the judgment, we can say Socrates is pale. But that's different than saying Socrates is human, because we just saw with Socrates is human, since means that, well, what happens in that judgment is that the definition of humanity transfers to Socrates. But when Socrates is pale, the definition of paleness does not transfer to Socrates. How do we know this? Right, and I got that sentence, these sentences, because Socrates, it is not true to say that Socrates is a color. So paleness is a color, but the account does not transfer to Socrates. So I have these little example sentences just to run through some of the permutations, right? Sorry, I shouldn't have written man, shorthand, I should have written human being, but what human being is in this human being. What pale is in this pale. what pale is not in human being, right? Like the universal human being, because to be a human being is not to be a color. What pale is not in this human being. For this man, this human being is not a color. So by running through these things, we see that, and this is kind of what Aristotle's after. He's like, I can say Socrates is pale, just as I can say Socrates is a human being. But the logic that is contained in these two sentences that are grammatically identical is quite different, because the human being lends its being to Socrates, but pale does not. No matter how pale Socrates is, Socrates never is a color. And it's never true to say of Socrates that he is a color. So what we see here are these, what we might, we want to call them logical relations, but that's a bit pallid, right? It's not quite what's going on here. It's not that this is how you ought to talk, but this is indeed how things are. That essential qualities or essential properties lend their being, and accidental or coincidental ones don't. That is an ontological statement. That's not a logical statement. That's not just a noticing something unique about the Greek language. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing this, and if so, I'm going to get back to the text.
I'll just say you said it was an ontological thing, which gets back to that original question I had about Brandon's, material incompatibility. Is it ontological or epistemic?
Uh-huh. Well, yeah. You want to talk about that?
No, because I'm trying to find my window so I can reshare it.
Okay, right. So, but what we're noticing is that that it's not because of some grammatical or syntactical structures of language that some predicates lend their being and others do not. But what we're noticing is that there are indeed determinate relations that obtain between things designated by language. And we learn to speak well when we let language reflect these prior structures. That pale is not the account of pale that tells us what pale is does not transfer to Socrates, but the account of human being does. Is not something you can read off language, and is not just a formal logical conclusion, right? We're actually thinking, the relations that make things the determinate kinds of things they are. And we're back at this whole dependence thing, right? There are things that are dependent on other things. Being white is dependent on this white, and this white doesn't exist without any relations, but is in fact this white of Socrates, or this white of the Acropolis, or this white of snow. So, what I'm pointing out here is that the justification that Socrates uses is not appealing to some formal logical permutations, and it's not appealing to peculiarities of the Greek language. He's appealing to the strange fact that the human being is pale, but is not just what the pale is. Human being is not just what the pale is. This is this is a gateway into this ontology thing, right? And we're beyond the social constructs and all of that, but we're at this very, very general level again of what anything must be in order to be something rather than nothing in particular. All right. Any remarks, or is people confused or just bored by that? Because you've heard it so often from me. So, yeah. Nothing? Okay.
Yeah, Michael, I just got
Yeah.
online. I just got finished with work. And
Oh,
I'm going to be
great.
driving back home, but I thought that was a wonderful summary. It was, very clear, just helpful to hear it, even
Oh.
though, yeah, it's definitely got resonance all throughout the last months.
Mm.
But it was nice, I just sense there's a precipitous or propitious point that we're at right here, because we're moving from, in terms of the overarching scope of Aristotle's presentation, we are going into being, I have a feeling, in a
Yeah.
new way. And so it's nice to hear that this up and down direction from substance to quality,
Mhm.
and how these distinctions have to be carefully made, because there's many differences in how to talk about that. Or
Mhm.
well, like pale in relationship to human being,
Mhm.
other attributes or qualities are not going to have the same directionality. They're
Right.
gonna, and you have to be very clear on that if you're going to talk in a clear way, I guess. So I like
Beautiful.
that. I got that from that. So thank you.
That's
Yeah,
fabulous. Thank you. Go ahead, Tyler.
This is one of those things in Aristotle where after he explains it, it seems obvious and it seems like you already basically knew it, but then you notice people forget this constantly when they're trying to do metaphysics or not realizing they're trying to do metaphysics, but
Mhm.
forget this little directionality.
Yeah, I think that's a great word. Thanks for introducing it, Clark. It's the directionality that is, so to speak, well, it's independent of any language, and it's independent of what you think about them or how you want to talk about them, right? And once you recognize this directionality, that puts the onus on you to think these matters in terms of the directionality of, well, I mean, my metaphor is the transfer of being, but
There's a
go ahead.
there's a term we use in engineering,
Yeah.
which is non-reversible.
Ah,
I think, unless I missed the point, I think that kind of also applies, right?
any other engineers? It seems right to me. Yeah, I mean, what goes down can't go up in this case, in the relationship of the categories. But this whole idea, that this whole idea that the pale doesn't transfer as its being, but the human being does with respect to Socrates. Well, it gets us back at why Aristotle distinguishes substance from coincident or accident in the first place, right? When we first started talking about it, it kind of came out of nowhere. It's like, okay, here's the categories and these are the relations, and Aristotle introduces the category of substance by saying, other things are said of substance, or other things are predicated of substance, but substance is not predicated of anything else. So it sounds just like it's a linguistic fact. At that point, it just sounds linguistic. Right? He's just projecting a certain grammatical structure or a structure of judgment onto the world, and then insisting on that. So it's we started out, it felt a little dogmatic, but now we're far enough along that we notice these little nuances, and these nuances don't follow from what he said in the categories, but in fact bolster it. We're moving from the conclusion in the categories, and we're getting into the premises. And he didn't make it as explicit in the categories as he just did here, that there are these directionalities, and they're independent of the labels you put on things or the Yeah, anyway, I've made that point a million times, so I won't make it again. I just always have to make it because we always, because our time always falls into historical explanations or linguistic explanations or social explanations, and we think that's ultimate, but that just papers over these fine distinctions that are essential to get if you want to understand why maybe the historical and the social and the whatever linguistic don't get us far enough. I see people talking about guacamole in the chat, so that tells me that you're ready to move on.
We started from something relevant, and then Peter spoke.
Awesome. Okay, so so the next point is, and I think it's a very important point to get not only just generally, but in terms of Aristotle's relation to Plato, is what goes on in this next paragraph. So if you don't mind my, yeah, go ahead.
Just real quick. It seems like a lot of new people joined around 5-ish our time, which leads me to believe that maybe because this is posted in multiple groups with different time zones, some people aren't syncing up on our actual starting time. Maybe we should update the posting to say, this starts at 4 p.m. Pacific Coast, the one and only standard time zone. And not the East Coast or the Middle Coast or anything like that.
Thank you. Yeah, if that applies to anybody who just joined, I'm deeply apologetic. I'm glad you're here, and let's clear that up.
I thought there was a notice saying that the whole meetup was delayed by an hour today.
Oh my God, where would that have come from?
I saw that also.
Huh?
I saw that the meeting today would be transferred from 4 to 5 p.m.
I think it's
Or was it a
double
future
posted.
meeting?
Yeah, I think there's one at 4 and there's one at 5, which is kind of weird.
That's the the off week where
That is very confusing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I just went to the Portland Free Philosophy Lectures. It's like Thursday, November 4th, 4 to 6 p.m. PDT. I assume that has something to do with the Pacific. From my end, it looks like I did everything right, but maybe something screwed up. I don't know. I'm deeply apologetic if anybody wanted to get here at the beginning and then didn't. Luckily, we're recording this, so if it and I do think the conversation has been quite good, so maybe the recording is worth your time. But Philip, I still see your hand up. Do you want to continue?
No, I just don't have a way of lowering the hand.
Okay, yeah, I just didn't want to lower your hand without your permission, without you having had a chance to say very much. So, thanks.
I think maybe like the confusion is if you happen to look at an off week, where you're split between Schmidt and then you do Aristotle at 5 and then you extrapolate.
Right.
That maybe what gets you in trouble.
Right. And as a matter of fact,
yeah,
I'm sure that's right. So everybody, you just have to read more carefully. Which is for the rest of 2021, and in 2022, I'm going to cancel everything and then recreate these things. So there's just one meetup for the every other week Aristotle, and then that's going to be totally separate from the Schmidt, and Schmidt's going to be totally separate from the open mic discussions. Right, that's going to be its own meetup and not piggybacking. Yeah, so exactly. So just every other week you start at 4 to do the Aristotle, and on the off weeks we start at 5 to do the Aristotle, because at 4 we're reading Arbogast Schmidt together. So yeah. And it's my own laziness. I should have just canceled everything and started fresh when we started the Schmidt, but I was lazy and didn't want to be confusing, but I managed to be more confusing. So anyway, yeah, I apologize. So, I just said a lot of cool things that you're going to want to watch the recording for. So, but I'm not going to go say them again. All right. But we are now focusing on his discussion of when when a thinker thinks that it is true to say of anything that it both is and is not what it is. And he will get into the reasons why some people do say that, and it's because of perception and change, perception and change that we've already treated in physics, so we can recur to that a little bit to help us understand. Then he says that does away with substance and essence. And we just made the point that, you know, there is something, there are these, this account transfers of the being of certain properties like human being to Socrates that doesn't happen with Socrates being pale, because it's not true to say that Socrates is a color, even though it is true to say Socrates that he's a human being. So there's these directionalities of transfer. Some things lend their being, others don't. That is an ontological fact, and it supports Aristotle's initial distinction that he gave in the categories between substances on the one hand and other modes of being that depend on substances. All right. Now we're going to get to the next point, which is how do properties, or do properties, what he calls coincidence, ever amount to one thing? Do they ever congeal into something one and something distinct, right? All right, so here we go. But if everything is said coincidentally, there will be no primary thing that they are said of. If a coincident always signifies a predication of some underlying subject. Hence, it is necessary for predication to go on without limit, but that is impossible, since no more than two things can be combined in predication. For a coincident does not coincide with a coincident, unless it is because both coincide with the same subject. I mean, for example, that the pale is musical and the musical is pale, because both coincide with the human. But it is not the case that Socrates is musical in that way, namely that both he and it coincide in some other underlying thing. Accordingly, since some things are said coincidentally in the former way, musical pale, others in the latter, those said in the way in which the pale coincides with Socrates cannot form an unlimited series in the upward direction. So that, for example, of pale Socrates, some other thing coincides. Since no one thing comes about from all of them. Nor indeed will another thing. For example, the musical be a coincident of the pale, since it no more coincides with the pale than the pale does with it. At the same time, too, what coincides in this way has been distinguished from what coincides in the way in which the musical coincides with Socrates. But in cases of the latter sort, the coincident does not coincide with the coincident, although in those of the former sort, it does, so that not everything will be said coincidentally. Even when things are said in this way, then there will be something signifying substance. And if that is so, it has been shown that contradictories cannot be predicated at the same time. All right. So continuing with the coincidentals. Just to make sure everybody is clear, when we use the term coincidentals, it's synonym with the term we've been using as accident in earlier sessions. So, so we're not talking about something different when we go from accidents to coincidence.
Seems like there's a distinction being drawn here between things. For instance, and the contradictories cannot be predicated at the same time. The contradictories are going to be things, I think for Aristotle, wasn't it true that the those are more like there's a distinction between contradictories and contraries, right?
Mm-hmm.
Contradictory is just applying the logical not.
Mm-hmm.
So there's my coffee cup, and then there's what's not my coffee cup. What's not my coffee cup includes the angst of the middle class and
Right.
Andromeda galaxy, and a whole bunch of things that have nothing to do with beverages, right?
Right.
But if like I have either coffee or tea in my coffee cup,
Mm-hmm.
those are contraries. Those are liquids that I can put in my coffee cup that are.
Mm-hmm.
It's more simply, but more generally, like colors are contraries. Red is the opposite or contradictory to blue.
Mm.
So something can't be both red and blue.
Mm-hmm.
But amongst the contradictories of red would include things like the musical.
Mm-hmm.
But yet the musical and red can coincide in some things. So there's a different way
Yeah.
of being. And again, I keep going back to this random lecture I'm listening to on Hegel, but he's talking about the it's a difference between what Hegel says between the alsos, the salt is cubical and white and tart. Those are the also those are compatible differences.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the incompatible differences are like, well, can't be both tart and sweet, or can't be both cubical and spherical.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's sort of like the contraries. A set of contraries, you can choose at most one of those, but the many contraries are compatible. Many classes of contraries are compatible in the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Philippe.
If we're using coincident as a synonym for accidental, then I'm wondering what happens to the verb to coincide. Like, for example, there's a sentence, I don't know, five lines above where you were reading. But in cases of the latter sort, like I'm gonna substitute accident here. Okay, so in cases of the latter sort, the accident does not accidentify with an accident. Like, I just don't know how to make the word coincide work in that context.
Well, it's just that when we're talking about the categories, we distinguish between substance and accident rather than substance and coincident. And so a certain linguistic tradition was established in this group of distinguishing the substance from accidents. And because we were using a different translation, and because Christopher Reeve, or whoever's Reeve, has not translated the categories yet. So I just wanted to acknowledge that the same word is kata symbebikos, right, in accordance with the accompanying. And the accompanying is another way to cash out both accident and coincident. But I recognize that there are grammatical differences in English and Greek that would prevent you from substituting salve veritatis accident, coincident for accident, or accident for coincident in every case.
Okay, so could you suggest? I mean, the verb to coincide seems perfectly good, but well, you see my problem, right? Like if okay, like I'm not expecting a simple substitution, but what can you say about the? Let me ask it this way: what can you say about the verb to coincide in this context, considering that coincident and accident are either exactly identical or very, very close to each other?
I don't know. I'd have to. It would depend on sense. I mean, I feel like it might just be a grammatical exercise. And maybe if I were better at grammar, I'd be better at finding substitutes. And maybe I'm just not up to the task. I'm not sure. But but I just wanted people not to be confused, to think that the coincidental is something different than what we were talking about before, when we were talking about the accidental, or that which a thing can lose or gain without becoming some other thing. That's really what I want you to have in mind when you think of either the coincidental or the accidental.
So, yeah, both coincidence needs substance in the same way that
Right.
accidents do. It's the
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it.
so you can't have an accident if it's not related to a substance. Accidents can't be accidental to other accidents
Mhm.
unless they're related by substance. So
Right.
it's you would have to tweak a few ways that you say things, but they're the same concept.
All right, Charlie.
I was just going to say, when you say the word coincide,
Mhm.
that has a connotation, a little bit of identity with, of being identical in a way. These two things coincide,
Mm.
but a coincident here or coincidental here doesn't mean identification, or it doesn't mean to be the same as. It means to be within something but dependent on that.
So
And it has a little bit different connotation in its application here.
Mhm.
things that are coincidental have to be brought together, which means they were separate in some respect prior to their coinciding. So they are not, it's not identity, that's correct.
Richard.
Also kind of related to this, hopefully not making more confusion here, but one of the definitions for incidental, I think,
Yeah.
like would make would also kind of be substitutable. Like I'm just reading here, accompanying but not a major part of something.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if we understand major to be a kind of a different way of saying essential.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
necessary.
Right.
Yeah. It's unfortunate that's, because words have different definitions, and then one of the definitions I'm reading here from incidental is liable to happen as a consequence of an activity, which makes it much more, that kind of, sorry, that's just kind of our language, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. No, but that's why we need to have these discussions in order to get rid of the senses that don't help us and focus on the ones that do. Philip York.
Yeah, so to signify this like cuts, it divides the world.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about like in the Hebrew Old Testament in Genesis, like as God speaks, he divides the world into distinct things, versus agglomerating coincidence is a different kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's not, I wouldn't call it analytical and synthetic, but it's different.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I can't quite. Obviously, the first one is what a distinction is, and the second one is any kind of accumulation, just adding predicates, and that's precisely what Aristotle has a problem with, right? You can add as many predicates together as you want. You can never get some one thing.
Right. It's coming up in bioethics in a huge way now, right? As you agglomerate creatures together, what are they?
Excellent.
Yeah, this reminds me of Hegel, the section in Hegel where people are sort of just kind of throwing predicates into the void of God.
Yeah.
So you've got, none of them are necessarily interrelated in substance when you just sort of aggregate them. And so they can't be predicates of anything. And so they sort of negate themselves if we try to treat them this way, as if they're utterly independent of substance, which they can't be effectively.
Right. And so let me see. I'm not sure this diagram of mine helps. And I apologize, Philippe, that I'm sharing a very rudimentary diagram that you won't be able to see, but maybe that is actually to your benefit. right? And so here, okay, so first of all, does everybody has sitting in front of a screen, can they see this pretty okay?
Yes.
All right, cool. So what, what I wanted to visualize here, to the left, and I've got Socrates in a box as the substance, and then and then many different names of different attributes of Socrates: pale, Greek, husband, 5'3", musical, right? And they're all together one because they all belong to Socrates as the substance. And so no matter how many predicates you attribute to Socrates, as long as you don't attribute, right, not Socrates or the opposite of Socrates, right, the unity remains because all of these attributes depend on the substance. And in the substance, they are all one. They're all together one. They all coincide in Socrates. And to the right, I've got just a pile of predicates. We start with at the bottom, right? Pale, Greek, husband, philosopher, musical. Nothing is just pale. Nothing is just pale and Greek. Nothing is just pale Greek and a husband. Nothing is just pale Greek, husband, philosopher, or musical. And then no matter how many attributes you pile up, no matter how many forms, how many qualities you pile up, you do not get one thing, right? Something, something definite, something that is the unity to which all of these belong. So these attributes are such that they cannot be thought of as constituting a unity unless they belong to something that, so to speak, brings that unity with it. That is substance. So we got another argument for this distinction between substance and accident. And I see some raised hands. So I'll make the rest of my point having to do with the boxes above after I've heard from the people with raised hands. So first we got Philippe.
Okay, it seems like the claim about accidents and the thing that the accidents are said about,
yeah,
it seems to me at least that there's three different ways in which that claim could be proposed, right?
Uh-huh.
There's the first level is the way you might say it to a 6-year-old, okay? So you could say, well, there's a whole lot of things you can say about Socrates, but Socrates himself is something independent of all those. And, notice how even if you were to spend the next week saying things about Socrates, there's still way, way more that you could say, right? So
Right.
the accidents don't exhaust. Okay,
Right.
so that is just stated as a brute fact. It's just said, and people tend to agree. The next way that you could approach this is to say, wait, there's more to it than that. All of this happens for a reason. So we're talking about Socrates as a separate substance, and the accidents and those two things, like the arrow, the directionality you're talking about. So the next level is to say all of that happens for a reason. There's an account that you can give of all that.
Mm-hmm.
Then the third level would be to say it's not just any old account, it's specifically a metaphysical account. Now, when I read Aristotle, I find it very hard to tell which of those three levels of analysis he's giving. I mean, I realize that a lot of commentators assume he's giving a metaphysical account, but I don't actually see that in the text. Like, it seems to me that in the text, it's compatible with him just merely asserting that this is a good way to analyze this, right, into substances and accidents. So can you say something about that, about these three, let's call them like levels of philosophical commitment or levels of metaphysical commitment? Because I'm really not seeing in the text how he's endorsing any one of those three levels of metaphysical commitment.
I don't know how to.
Hey, Philip, I think that's a good question, but maybe, I'm just asking the group. I'm still behind on understanding this. So before we go into critiquing how he's approaching this, I think I'd like to understand what he's doing.
Just for the record, I'm not critiquing it.
Understood.
I mean, I do that occasionally. I admit that, probably more than other people in the group, but I'm not doing that in this particular case. I'm simply saying that there are three levels of metaphysical commitment, and just at the level of trying to understand what Aristotle's saying, I can't tell which level of metaphysical commitment he's endorsing.
Well, I mean, if we just go with the idea that that no matter how big your pile of qualities and relations gets, you never get something definite by adding qualities, right? So Aristotle's focus is on sense to be is to be something definite. Then how must we speak in such a way that our speech is speech about the definite and doesn't make things indefinite? And so the first thing to say is that to speak in such a way that nothing is anything but coincidence destroys the possibility of anything being something. So to think of this heap of coincidence as how things really are actually does away with things. Okay, so so what I see, I can't quite map your three levels onto what I think Aristotle's doing, but I don't think, but that doesn't mean that there's not something to your three levels. And the problem is that I don't know what you mean by metaphysical, right? Just for this reason, Aristotle doesn't know that word. It's not an Aristotelian word. And as a matter of fact, just a little interesting tidbit, metaphysical only occurs 3 times in the extant Greek literature of antiquity. And 3 times, and never by an Aristotelian.
Yeah, same with the word ontology.
No, let me correct this. So metaphysics is used 3 times. Metaphysical doesn't exist in the Greek language of the antiquity, right? And so what we're doing when we say, well, Aristotle's doing something metaphysical, there's a little piece of there's a little bit of what do you call that? Like imputing certain things that we consider metaphysical into Aristotle. And so I don't know what to do with that. With that idea that he might be doing something metaphysical is over against just. Okay, so I understood your first level to say,
Sure.
say that well, he's just assuming that there is this thing called Socrates, and Socrates is somehow the vehicle, but he's not really explicating that. And I would say, yeah, at this point, that's true. He's pointing at substance all over the place, but he still owes us a fuller account of substance. So there is some of that first level going on. And to be honest, I don't remember your second level, so I'm just going to give it back to you.
I can rephrase my point just saying 3 levels of commitment about what there is. Okay, so and in fact, like as you were explaining, I noticed that everything you said was compatible with making absolutely no commitments whatsoever about what there is. Like you were describing a way of speaking.
Yeah.
And we can have that way of speaking without making any commitments about what there is. So that was sort of my first level of analysis, right? Where we just sort of naively, not in a bad sense, but we just say, here's 2 ways of talking. We can talk about the substance. We can talk about, Socrates as some sort of totality that can't be exhausted by his accidents, and then we can talk about the accidents. And that entails no commitment whatsoever about what there is. And my second level was that we say that there are commitments, we're going to make some commitments about what there is, but there's a sort of a wide range of types of commitment.
Mm.
And then my third level is where, yes, where my problems with the word metaphysics come in, because I take it that metaphysical commitments, which you rightly point out is anachronistic, that's a particular kind of commitment for giving an account. So it's okay if you smush my last two levels together.
Okay.
Let's make it a distinction between saying that there's a way of talking which makes little or no commitments about what there is, and
Yeah.
then there are ways of saying, oh, look, we're talking in a certain way. Maybe that means we're committed to certain things about what there is.
Right. Okay. So that's super interesting the way you broke that down. I really appreciate it. I want to break my answer into two parts. I don't think that Aristotle is at all committed to what there is in any of this. Right. Montgomery Firth has a nice expression he calls the population problem. And that is one problem in contemporary metaphysics of how many different kinds of things are there? What constitutes the furniture of the universe, right? Is it all mid-sized dry goods, or are there spooky things, right? So what sort of things are there? Aristotle's not committed to the population problem at all, in terms of saying that, well, there are certain things that really are, and there are other things that are only kind of are. But what he's doing instead is he's saying that, you know, whatever we finally decide merits the attribution substance, there's a whole lot of conditions it's going to have to fill, and the whole lot of implications that it's going to have when we determine what substance is and which things are substance. But we don't know yet very much about substance, so we don't really know what things ultimately are yet. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I could go on and on. This is a big topic for me, but I'll stop and let somebody else have a chance.
Thanks for your question, Philip. Peter was next, if I remember correctly.
You may have already covered things. I was just going to note that there's a big difference between the set of all the accidental or coincidental characteristics you can make of something like, you know, pale, musical, snub-nosed, all that sort of stuff. That does not constitute an underlying subject or a substance.
Mm-hmm.
And but you sort of made that point. But it gets really to the point of like why things like, I don't know, computer learning or something like that, just because it can, you can make a set of, you can take any random pile of things and metaphorically put squiggly brackets around it and turn it into a set. That doesn't mean the set has any coherence or is a thing or has any being.
Right.
It's just a pile of things. And so that you can modify, or the coincidence can adhere in something that has being, but they don't themselves, you can't add enough qualities together, and all of a sudden being pops in, or at least the type of being that is the primary being or substance. It's a different type of being. I mean, being gray is different than being that old mare who happens to be gray.
Exactly. And that gets it exactly at this whole account transfer. You know, if Socrates is gray, it doesn't mean he's a color. But if Socrates is a human being, he's a rational living animal.
But I think especially in the coming from the computer side of things, it's so easy to think that, oh, if we can just throw a set around it, make a collection of it, make a class of these things, then now we have something. And that's not really true.
It's some one thing. Exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean, but nevertheless, I mean, it just gets, you know, to the Aristotelian point that, you know, there's a difference between man-made unities and like a statue, and things that are unities through themselves, right? And putting brackets around something is just artificially producing it's producing an artifact as a unit.
Doesn't have a nature, right?
Right. Exactly. Tyler.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna do my whole spiel about how the structure of substance is also required for the act of account giving. so I think what Aristotle is doing, and I like the population problem analogy. Yeah, I'm not going to do the whole spiel. Thanks, Peter. So
Give us something to work with.
In order to give an account of something, you have to already have substance in some manner, because accounts always have coincidence, but they also have necessary interrelations. And so something can't be an account of something if you don't already have the unity of substance. Okay, essence, as Peter likes essence. You had to have, and we go back to the very bare bones metaphysics, you had to have plurality in a unity with sameness and difference in different respects. And so Aristotle is investigating not all of the different things we can give accounts of, but how to give accounts of anything without undermining the possibility of account giving, as well as just not contradicting ourselves in general.
Right.
And I think substance is the reason he's sort of the reason substance is taken in some way for granted. I think it ends up being like the refutation or demonstration by refutation. We cannot give accounts if there is no substance, so it makes sense to not assume there is no substance at the outset.
Well, I mean, the alternative is, of course, to say, well, everything is man-made, and and if we want to define the plant as including its vase or not including its vase, I mean, we just put different brackets around things, I guess. But that flies in the face of how certain things are self-unifying as over against other things that aren't, and that's part of what the whole inquiry into nature was trying to attune us to, is this difference in the implications. Philippe, I see your hand. Go for it.
Yeah. So the way Tyler took this strikes me as a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier, right? Like I'm saying that Aristotle is expressing a way of speaking, right? You speak in terms of Socrates being one thing and his accidents being something else. And I gave the example of how you could be explaining this to a 6-year-old, and you don't go into a lot of depth, and the point gets across, right? This way of speaking just on its own without any commitments to what there is has a lot of power all on its own. Like I suspect most 6-year-olds would get this, right? That, you could go describing Socrates forever, but you're never going to exhaust all of the things that can be said about Socrates. And that it makes sense to also, in addition to all of the accidents, to also have this other way of talking about Socrates, not just piling on the accidents, but just having a word like Socrates to describe him, right? So you can get at that point without having to pile on all the accidents. And I'm saying that the text doesn't actually seem to support any further commitments about what there is, but Tyler felt the need to make further commitments about what there is. And he's not alone. Like, he's in very good company, right? The vast majority of Aristotle interpreters, it seems, do make that, what I'm tempted to call a metaphysical leap, let's just call it a leap into commitments about what there is. But I'm just saying it doesn't seem from the text that you have to be committed to making claims about what there is. You can just have a way of speaking, and that is compatible with everything that Aristotle is saying.
You're muted, Michael.
Sorry, my dog was howling. How do you interpret this paragraph, Philip?
The one we just read?
Yeah. Are you saying it's just ambivalent between three God-given ways of making this distinction, and Aristotle's cool with that, or is there something else going on?
Well, I mean, I feel like he's strongly saying, don't think that talking about accidents is going to get you everything you want, right? Like, don't think that talking in terms of accidents is a sufficient way to account for how we go about interacting with things. And he's saying, in addition to talking about accidents, you also have to talk about things like Socrates as something over and above. Well, again, right, the singly reification nature of Indo-European languages is working against me here, right? Because I just said I used the word a separate thing called Socrates, right? But you don't you can be very, very careful and avoid that reification tendency that Indo-European languages have. I don't know what he's saying, right? Like I know that he's cautioning us to keep these two ways of speaking separate. Like, don't think that that you could analyze everything as just speech about accidents. So that's one thing that's in my mind. Another thing that's in my mind is how incredibly weird Greek philosophy can get when it comes to naming and things like that, right? You know, think of the Cratylus, right? Think of just how incredibly weird Plato's Cratylus can get. And that always makes me wonder, like, what exactly naming meant for the Greeks. And I don't know.
Okay. Mike.
Philip, I think I do share some of your I guess bewilderment. I don't know the exact word, but I think on the one hand, you're seeing I guess these sections as split, right? On the one hand, we're talking about deep metaphysical things and being, and on the other hand, we're talking about these predicates, right? And where's the connection, I guess? Like, and Tyler, I guess, was making a connection, and you're wondering where that is. And I wonder where that is as well. I'm just waiting to try to find that out through the text. And I guess I am giving the text the benefit of the doubt, or Aristotle the benefit of the doubt, and hopefully I'll get there. But yeah, I guess I do see your point, but I guess maybe you're calling it out a little too early before we really, struggle with this, but yeah.
Yeah, bewilderment's a good word. Yeah, I'm just trying to be very resolute about not importing things into the text that may not be there. And I'm interested in the idea that there may be a tendency for commentators to import metaphysical type concepts into this text that may not be there. And yes, I'm using that slightly anachronistic word. So there may be a tendency for interpreters to import commitments about what is into the text that Aristotle himself may not be making. And it's largely just because I know from reading a lot of ancient Greek philosophy how incredibly weird the Greeks are when it comes to naming, right? Like undergraduate syllabi in philosophy tend to avoid the weirdness, right? They'll teach, something like the Meno, where naming behaves in a way more or less the way it behaves for us, and undergraduate syllabi tend to ignore the Cratylus, where naming gets unspeakably weird. So I'm just trying to stay very, very neutral and not import metaphysical commitments that Aristotle may not have.
Whether it's metaphysical or not, we do have this argument that that I think, let me see, is an important component of his difference with Plato, and that is that forms alone that are supposed to account for unity don't account for unity, and no collection of properties is sufficient for something to be a definite thing, and only what is a definite thing, as opposed to and I know not what. Only what is a definite thing and not an I know not what counts as being, is definite, is limited, has a limit. And if our speech is such that it blurs, limits, eliminates, limits, smushes things together so that we can't distinguish them anymore. And if our speech does that, if the consequences of our speech entail that, right, then we might be speaking, we might be making sense, but we are not tracking being. There is no being to what we're saying, and we need to rectify this. Right, and so he's saying, you know, one way in which one can mess this up is to think of everything as accidental properties. There is no substance, there is no fundamental unity. It's just all accidental, contingent, whatevers. And then any unity is an artifact. It comes from our practices and social and histories and blah 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 blah. And Aristotle is just making this point: is if something is, it is a one. It is a definite something. And turning everything into piles of accidental properties precisely blurs the difference between one thing and another. It blurs all the differences. And as he says, all things are one at that point, but in a bad sense. Namely, if Socrates is a human being, he is also a boat, and he is also a star, and he is also a moat, and he is also a woman, and he is also, you know, also he is in fact everything.
Trireme and a wall.
A trireme and a wall, exactly. So, that conclusion shows us that if we're committed to this, everything's a coincidence, right? We have ceased being able to signify, and our language is no longer a language. It doesn't make distinctions. It's just sounds. And just because people pretend they understand doesn't mean that the language is anything but sounds. We've destroyed language. And Aristotle says, if there's to be understanding, and if there is to be knowledge, and indeed, if a person is to have thoughts, those thoughts, that language, there must always be something definite in order for language to refer, in order for signification to be possible. So we can say an ontological presupposition of language being about anything is that what is must be definite, because otherwise everything, all is one in the bad sense that I just adumbrated. And so, you know, whether we call that metaphysical or conditions of possibility of true and false sentences, and that, you know, kind of call it semantics or ontosemantics or linguistic ontology. I mean, we get lots of names, right? But we want to learn how to speak well, not by importing our beliefs about the proper distinctions on him, but see how he might teach us to speak better than we do, that leads to Babylonian confusion when everything becomes kind of anything. So that's my recommendation. And I know that, yeah, okay, so anyway, I think everybody's probably on board with that, and that this whole digression was really just to get a sense, to see how unity is, you know, how something is something definite. It underlies the whole question of being, and it underlies the question of non-contradictory speech. So contradictory speech cannot be about anything. And so when we're contradicting ourselves, we're not talking about anything, even if we practically, you know, people understand us, people respond in the right ways and everything like that, right? But what we're saying is neither true nor false, and therefore isn't even, you know, it isn't even about anything. That's the general point I wanted to make, that I thought this paragraph was very, very powerful about. So I see Philip's got his hand up. Philippe has got his hand up. I'm going to go to Philippe, and then what I'm going to ask everybody, since we didn't get to Gamma 5, and I really wanted to, it's short, but it is we are getting into, to some of his interesting points about perception, the relationship of perception and truth, perception and definite speech. I would love to do this on to begin our off Thursday Aristotle with some ruminations about Gamma 5, so that we can do justice to the fact that you guys tried to read it this week. So we'll hit that for a while next week, and then we'll open the floor to more general questions and remarks. Anyway, thanks for your patience, Philippe. You're up.
Okay. Am I unmuted?
No, I can hear you.
Okay. So let me rephrase my point in terms of the way you just said it. Like, because you, Michael, were pointing out something related to the last sentence in the paragraph we're looking at, right? So, and if that is so, it has been shown that contradictories cannot be predicated at the same time. Okay. So my point doesn't really concern the debate between those who think that you can predicate anything of anything. Like, I realize there were ancient Greeks who went in that direction.
Right.
So let's just forget about all of those people, and let's only consider the people who are committed to rational discourse as Aristotle would see it, right? Like, you can't say that Socrates is in Athens and in Sparta. You can't say that he's a frog and a tree. You can't, right? So all of that. So I'm only talking about the people who are committed to talking in this rational way that Aristotle is advocating. That's what I understand. I understand the rational way that Aristotle is advocating, where you make this distinction between talking about accidents and talking about the substance. But now let's take those people who are all committed to the same rational way of speaking, and now we ask them, well, what sort of commitments to what is are entailed by your commitment to speak rationally? So they all, and I would answer that they may all have the same commitment to speaking rationally in terms of substances and accidents, but then from there, we can't tell much at all about the range of commitments to what is that could underlie that, right? Like, because you could imagine somebody like a cliche Platonist who has deep, deep commitments, deep and strange and bizarre commitments about what there is, which would entail this sort of rational way of talking that Aristotle is advocating. You could also imagine somebody who has almost no commitments about what is, who just says, well, this is a good way to talk, like substances, accidents. Yeah, if we just keep talking that way, discourse seems to go really, really well. So why don't we just keep talking that way? And I don't have to have any commitments at all about what is. All I have to have commitments to are to this very good way of talking so that discourse stays rational. So those would be some extremes. I'm not going to suggest it's on a continuum, but it just seems like there's an enormous number of different possible commitments to what is that you could have, even amongst these people who are committed to this rational way of speaking that Aristotle is advocating.
Yeah, I wouldn't deny that. I mean, I wouldn't deny that at all. But Gamma just gives us a first step, right? And so his inquiry doesn't stop there. And once, so we've started with substance and accident, and we developed some notions about what anything must be in order to be anything at all, namely have dependence relations that are modeled in substance accidents categories or concepts. And we see now we're getting some arguments about account transfers that show the fundamentality of certain things to other things that cannot obtain in the reverse direction. So they're irreversible. So regardless of what we ultimately say is real, it's already caught up in a web of logical relations that Aristotle is elaborating, and it seems like all those commitments that might come after that don't come from that. And I think that part of the challenge is just to stay on the line of what we're thereby committed to when we are committed to the difference between substance and accidents and the unidirectionality of the account transfers that are independent of what one happens to be committed to. And yeah, so that's my answer, inadequate or not. You can follow up in just a second, Philip, but I got Tyler's hand first. Or Philippe, sorry.
Yeah, I was
Tyler.
just going to make a short. I think Aristotle's not just talking about a way of speaking, but a way of thinking, right? There is no such thing as speaking rationally without thinking rationally.
Mm.
But I think it is the case that there are people who think that speaking rationally in a certain way will somehow do the work of thinking, and that can be a bad path to go down. But I in terms of commitments, I think what rational thinking is committed to is not undermining one's own activity of rational thinking by assuming something that makes it impossible, and also not clinging to things that when they've been shown, when it's been shown that they cannot be the case. So it's more of a commitment to not doing things than it is a commitment to particular things. So it makes sense that there would be many different concerns amongst rational thinkers.
I love that. I think that's quite beautiful. That rationality has that negative component. I think you're exactly right. It's about avoiding the mistakes and then soldiering on, forging on. And let me see. Your first point that I loved to is all those commitments that one might bring to the inquiry must themselves be. Submit themselves to the inquiry, and if those commitments make the rational irrational, or entail the contradictions, or make rational speech impossible, then it doesn't matter what kind of, if you have these affection for these commitments, they got to go. And so, but that's always, it's the proof is always in the pudding. You always got to. You've got to go through the dialectic. You've got to work through the dialectic and see whether those commitments are compatible or not from the basic framework of as Philippe put it, rational discourse, rational speech. And it would not be rational if it weren't knowledge. And if it's knowledge of something, namely that which is thought in that knowledge. And so we're lessening the range of possibility very, very quickly here of what candidates would be suitable candidates for being discussed in this way. I think that just reintroduces the subject-object distinction, very modern, and puts it into Aristotle accidentally. So to think that there's a bunch of candidates out there that that we can just think about with our rational speech and be rational about, but even that rational speech might not actually capture them. They might evade that rational speech, and then that begs the question of what makes this speech superior to any other speech. Right. So thanks for that. I think that was super interesting. It helps get a little bit at what's going on here. Anyway, yeah, so I've said enough. Clark, I see your hand.
Yeah. Let's see what Tyler said, talking about rationality that way just brings back an old issue that I don't yet understand. Is rationality, in the sense that you're using it, or Tyler's using it, or whoever's using it, me, are we referring to this kind of linguistic analysis that Aristotle is presenting? Is that what we mean by rationality, such that when Aristotle claims quite at the beginning of things, the human nature is one in which we can describe human nature as that being that is rational? So he's, how is it that we can determine that we're rational without having a definition of it per se until we actually create that definition? What is it that allows us to conclude that we're rational before we've learned this process? And that we can act like everybody is rational. Isn't there a huge continuum upon which when we say that by nature humans are rational animals, that it's meaningful, and not on such a big, I don't know. I am very confused about how we're using the word rationality right now. Is it something distinct from what we're actually trying to teach here, which is follow the principle of non-contradiction, and that is the basis of all logic? Something like that. Is that, I guess I don't have a question there. Yeah, I'm asking.
Tyler, did you want to respond to that a bit? Philippe is the one who introduced rational discourse. Sorry, what's that? Is something going haywire with the sound. Anyway, Tyler, if you wanted to respond to Clark, feel free. Philippe brought up rational discourse as a descriptor of what Aristotle is talking about. And as I understood Philippe, he was trying to say, isn't it possible to just distinguish language from what language is about and just have like a nice formally coherent language, and then just not worry about whether it's about anything or not, but it just kind of works as a nice formal system. And I pushed back against that a little bit, and I understood Tyler to do the same. And so there's a sense in which I wouldn't be on board with Philippe's account of rationality there, because it lacks being. To be a little bit polemical.
You got to let me answer that.
Yeah.
I'm not pushing that line at all. What I'm pushing is I'm mapping out a space of possibilities. I'm mapping out a range where people who are committed to rational discourse, whatever that may turn out to mean, more or less the kind of rational discourse that Aristotle is putting forward here, where you can't say that Socrates is in Athens and Sparta, and you can't do that sort of thing. So I'm just mapping out a space of possibility and at one end of that spectrum would be the idea that all you have is discourse that just so happens to be rational, and we can't say, and it doesn't imply any commitments about what there is, all the way up to the version that I think Tyler would be happy with, the idea that the very fact that we have rational discourse does strongly suggest to us that we should have some commitments about what is. But just so it doesn't seem completely loopy that I'm giving this full range, like the very first sentence, Aristotle says, but if everything is said coincidentally, there will be no primary thing that they are said of.
Right.
It's not outrageous to point out that Aristotle is talking about how we talk. And so that's one thing. Now, to answer Clark's question about what rationality is, I think that's a big question, and I think we should give little bits and pieces. So I'll give a little bit and piece of an answer. I mean, Plato, over the door of his academy, said, "Let no one ignorant of mathematics enter here." There's something to that effect. Now, one thing that perhaps made mathematics a paradigm of rational discourse is it has a way of compelling belief or compelling agreement, right? The thing about math proofs is that you can very often, when you see the claim that's being made, you say, "Oh no, that's crazy. That can't possibly be true." And then you see the proof, and within a remarkably short time, you said, "Oh, yep, I was wrong. The conclusion is correct." That has happened to me thousands of times when I put on my other hat and function as a mathematician, right? There are just outrageous claims in mathematics that just simply, intuitively just can't be true. And then you see the proof and you go, "Whoa, yeah, okay, that's true." So that way that certain styles of talking and thinking have a way to compel agreement, I think that was a big part of rationality for the Greeks, especially Plato, and I see no reason to think that Aristotle didn't take that on board as well, that way that part of what rational discourse is that it compels agreement amongst people who initially disagreed. So at the start of the conversation, they disagree. At the end of the conversation, they agree. And I would say that was a mark, for the Greeks, that was a mark of rational, that they would take that as evidence that rationality was in play in that conversation. I'll stop there.
No, thank you. No, I appreciate that. I think that was very, very compelling and clear the way you did that. I just did want to point out that there are methods of creating an agreement that were known as by the sophist as rhetoric, that were also incredibly effective in getting many, many people of one mind, and but that would not necessarily be considered rational. So I think that what you're saying is a necessary, but not, and I think, I'm sure you agree with this, it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition of rational discourse.
It's merely one thread of what rationality meant to the Greeks, and yeah, like there would be a question begging aspect, right? Like, because the mathematical discourse compels agreement, and somebody of the mindset of Plato, and me for that matter, would want to say, well, hey, rationality was in play, and in that discourse, and then the question arises, well, how is it different from the discourse of the sophists? And most mathematicians want to make the question begging statement, well, because rationality was present, because obviously rationality was present in the mathematical discourse. So I get it. Like, I'm just talking about one thread of what rationality might have meant to the Greeks.
No, that was wonderful. I appreciate that. Thank you. Tyler.
Yeah, regards agreement, I think there's two important ways of talking about agreement. One is that you get many people to kind of recite and vaguely speak the same way. And another is that they agree on the same content. But in order to get people to speak about the same content, they also have to think the same, not just say the same words. So they have to share an object in some sense. I think that is the work that Plato and Aristotle considered more important and more belonging to philosophy than rhetoric. And secondly, with regard language, I think we always have to keep in mind that if we're going to say that language is something distinct from logic, we somehow have to say what language is as distinct from logic, which is a logical problem.
Indeed.
So that kind of attempt to separate language off from logic throws us back into a problem that we have to effectively use both as one to understand.
Interesting. Thank you. Awesome. Oh, let's see. Darlene.
Yeah, something he just said made me think of something that I've noticed, where people will be just copycatting the same words, and really the goal is to be doing virtue signaling. Like, hey, I'm a good person. Like tonight I was in a knitting group with several older ladies over in the southern East Coast, and I think it was Raleigh. And one of the ladies was attempting to say a lot of what I hear a lot of California people say, where they talk about, oh, I don't eat anything gluten, blah, blah, blah. She was attempting to copycat everything that they're saying. And one of the other older ladies asked her why, and she could not answer why.
Right.
Because one of the reasons why is because the reason why is actually because she's trying to get fit, and her definition of getting fit is to be healthy, and the new in thing to be healthy is to not eat gluten. So she was just regurgitating the words, but she did not have the same thought because she's not understanding the science. And so what he just now said about people just saying the same words but not having the same mindset just made me, thought of that. So
That's great. No, and I like the metaphor of mindset, because it's fixed and determinate, and that's what a concept is. So I appreciate your offering that language, Darlene. That's great. I'm going to wind it up here in a couple minutes, but I see Philippe's hand up. So let's get Philippe back into the conversation. Philippe, you're up.
Yeah, a couple of things. Okay, I'm glad, Michael, you brought up the example of the sophists, right? Because I think that if we see a bunch of mathematicians working over a Euclidean geometry proof, and at first they look at the conclusion and they say, no, that can't be right, that just can't be right. But then they work through the proof, and the ones who thought that couldn't be, they all come to an agreement. Mm-hmm. I think we all feel it in our bones that rationality was at work in mm-hmm. that way of proceeding. Mm-hmm. And I think we all feel it in our bones that rationality is not at work in the cases that Darlene is talking about, even mm-hmm. though agreement was achieved, right? So, but my concern, and this comes up more in the Schmidt readings, right? I'm concerned that thing we all have where we feel it in our bones, that rationality was in play, that for some of us that can turn into more than just a feeling that you feel in your bones. It can turn into something analogous to a proof that there must be some sort of deep metaphysical distinction between mathematical ways of talking and the kinds of talking that Darlene is referring to. Now, I would love to have a clear, rational way of making that distinction, but I need a lot to be convinced of that. Yeah, so that's one thing that's going on. I thought I'd give an example. Like I don't want to come across as the person who has no metaphysical commitments, right? Like, so let me give you an example. Like with artificial intelligence, right? Like there are now computer programs that can fool you for a very long time as to whether they are a person or a machine. You can have a conversation with this thing for a long time. It's easier it's more convincing if it happens over a computer where you're typing back and forth. And so I would say that even though the accidental properties of that program and the accidental properties of the human interlocutor match up, I myself am willing to make a metaphysical claim in this case, right? And say that, even if the program can convince me for a very long time, nevertheless, I myself am willing to make metaphysical claims that the human is somehow ontologically different from the program. Mm. So I don't want anything I said to suggest that I'm opposed to making metaphysical claims. I was just trying to map out a space of possibility and say that we don't know, or at least from the way I'm reading, from the reading we've had, it's very hard to tell exactly what metaphysical commitments Aristotle has. And I'm trying not to be influenced by my, reading of the various commentators who attribute things to Aristotle that may or may not be in the text itself of Aristotle.
Right. No, I appreciate that. I'm going to have problems with some of these possibility spaces that you bring to Aristotle, but that's part of the healthy give and take. And I'm glad I've got people to push back and disagree with me. But I'm going to let you know that right now, right? That not all possibility spaces are equally unprejudicial.
Yeah, I'm making no commitments to which parts of that space I like. I'm just mapping out the space.
Right. But the question is are these objective are these so-called objective possibilities even do they give a framework that Aristotle is somehow obligated to have an answer to? I think not. I think not. I think that his inquiry is just a different one, and we give him a bunch of alternatives and say, it's got to be one of these, right? Aristotle can't answer back. But the question is why? Unless it's actually helping us get at the details of the text, it sounds more like a challenge than a hermeneutical tool for understanding. That's my sense of how these things are working. Do you ever thought about that, Philippe?
Well, I mean, okay, when people are the first to start talking in a certain way and thinking in a certain way and philosophizing in a certain way, often they don't know what they mean, right? Often they're not sure what they mean. Like the first person who said, hey, look, all dogs have something in common, right? Now, Indo-European languages shove you in this reification direction. So that person said they all have something in common. And somebody else might have said, wait a minute, do you mean like a thing, like a thing, or do you mean that they all have like commonality or like some way of speaking that doesn't do the reification thing? And that first person who noticed that all dogs have something in common might have said, I don't know, I'm just noticing something here. Like don't pin anything definite on me. I'm just noticing that, like they point to 3 dogs, like that, and that have similar features, and they point to a chicken and says that has very different qualities, right? So yeah, like I'm not, like Aristotle as a person who's philosophizing early on in the tradition, like he's going to say things and not necessarily have something definite in mind, or he might have a whole range of things in mind, or So I'm agreeing with you in a long-winded, roundabout way.
No, I appreciate that. Aristotle himself was at the end of a long tradition, had a lot of spoken theories available. So he's already at the end of a long line. So we don't need to really, it's just a kind of an accident of our placement in time that we think he's towards the beginning of something. So I guess what I also want to say is, don't assume Aristotle doesn't know what he's talking about.
Well, wait, but that's kind of the opposite of what you just said, right? Because you were saying like, don't attribute